Right now, at this exact moment, somewhere in Bangladesh, a woman is harvesting protein from a pond the size of a living room. In Vietnam, a farmer hasn't purchased commercial feed in 3 years. In rural Ghana, chickens are being fed a system so efficient it almost defies logic. And in the American Midwest, a retired school teacher with 6 acres and 8 chickens is quietly doing the same thing. None of them learned this from a corporation. None of them are waiting on a feed truck. And most people watching this video have never heard of any of it. Let's start with something uncomfortable. In the last 4 years, the price of commercial poultry feed has climbed sharply across most of the United States. Corn prices, soy prices, transportation costs, processing costs, storage costs. By the time that bag reaches your hands, you've already paid for 6 different systems, none of which belong to you. And for millions of small farmers and backyard flock owners, that bill keeps arriving whether the hens are laying or not. There's a term some agricultural economists use: feed conversion dependency. It means the degree to which a farm cannot function without purchasing feed from outside its own system. And by that measure, most American small farms are almost entirely dependent. Think about that for a second. A farm, that cannot feed itself. That wasn't always the case. And somewhere between the grain elevators and the feed mills and the delivery schedules, most American small farmers lost the knowledge of what to do instead. Millions of farmers around the world never lost it. They kept going. They kept refining it. And what they've built is something most American small farmers have never been shown until now. When agricultural researchers began comparing small farm productivity across different regions of the world, they noticed something they didn't expect. The farms producing the most food per square foot, the most eggs, the most meat, the most sustainable yield over time, were not the farms with the most technology. They were the farms with the most integration. Integration is a specific word. It means that nothing on the farm exists in isolation. The chickens aren't just chickens. They're part of a system. The pond isn't just a pond. It's a production unit. The food scraps aren't waste. They're an input. In parts of rural Asia, this kind of integration is so normal it doesn't have a name. It's just farming. In America, we called it buying feed. In most parts of the world, they called that unnecessary. And the core principles behind these systems, the ones working right now in Vietnam, in Ghana, in Bangladesh, work just as well on half an acre in Georgia, or 3 acres in Ohio, or a backyard in central Texas. Here's where it gets strange. So why don't more American small farmers know about it? That's a question worth sitting with. Let's start with the first system, because the first one is almost impossible to believe until you see it. It grows on water. It doubles in size every 2 days under the right conditions, and it contains more protein per pound than most commercial feeds on the market. It is called duckweed, and it is, by almost every measurement, one of the most remarkable plants on Earth. It is the smallest flowering plant in existence. A single frond, a single plant, is barely visible to the naked eye. But together in a pond or a trough or even a cattle tank, duckweed forms a carpet so dense it can completely block sunlight from reaching the water below. And it does this not in weeks, but in days. Under optimal conditions, a duckweed population can double in 24 to 48 hours. Think about what that means for a farmer. You start with a pound. In 2 days, you have 2 pounds. In 4 days, 4 pounds. By the end of 2 weeks, if conditions are right, You have hundreds of pounds of live, fresh, nutrient-dense feed. Chickens eat it eagerly. Ducks are named after it for a reason. And independent research from multiple university studies, including work cited by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has documented protein content in duckweed ranging from 25 to 45% of dry weight. For comparison, standard layer pellets typically run around 16 to 18% crude protein. Now, duckweed isn't a complete feed. That needs to be said clearly, but as a supplement. As a fresh protein source produced on-farm with almost zero input cost, its potential is significant. And the infrastructure required? A shallow pond, a stock tank, a bathtub, a kiddie pool. Duckweed doesn't care where it floats. It only cares about sunlight, warmth, and a small amount of nutrients in the water. If you want to start growing it yourself, Live Duckweed Starter Culture is something you can order and have in a container within days. I've left a link in the description. Now, here is where most people stop. They learn about duckweed. They're impressed. They file it away. But the farmers who actually build systems around this understand something deeper. They understand why it works. And once you understand why, everything else in this video will make a different kind of sense. Every animal on your property eats something, and everything it eats eventually becomes waste. That waste is not garbage. It is loaded with nitrogen, with phosphorus, with organic compounds that plants need to grow. Most farms treat that waste as a problem to manage, a thing to shovel, a thing to dispose of. But here is what makes these old and hidden systems different. In a farm that feeds itself, that waste is the most valuable thing on the property, because it becomes food. Not directly. You're not feeding chickens their own waste, but you are feeding their waste to the land and letting the land convert it into something the chickens can eat. That's why duckweed and a chicken yard belong next to each other. The chickens produce the nutrients. The water carries them. The duckweed converts them into protein. Then the chickens eat the duckweed. That same principle runs beneath every system in this video, and the next plant takes it even further. It also doesn't look like much. A reddish-green mat on the surface of a pond. Easy to overlook, easy to mistake for algae or debris. But this plant, Azolla, has fed rice paddies, livestock, and entire farming communities across Asia for more than 1,000 years. And it does something duckweed cannot. Azolla fixes nitrogen, meaning it takes nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and converts it into a form that plants and animals can use. You don't add nitrogen. You don't purchase fertilizer. The Azolla harvests it from the air above the pond. In traditional Vietnamese and Chinese agriculture, Azolla was grown in rice paddies as a living fertilizer. It replaced inputs. It restored nitrogen to the soil without a bag, without a truck, without a cost. But Azolla has another dimension that matters deeply to livestock farmers. Its protein content, again, dry weight, ranges from roughly 19 to 30% depending on conditions. Rich in essential amino acids. Relatively low in fiber, meaning animals digest it efficiently. Research conducted by agricultural programs in India has shown that when Azolla is incorporated as a partial supplement for laying hens, replacing a portion of conventional feed, egg production is maintained and in some cases slightly improved. In parts of Vietnam, this knowledge is ordinary. In America, most small flock owners have never even heard the word Azolla. Live Azolla Starter is available from specialty aquatic plant growers, not something you'll find at a farm supply store, but easy to source and ship. Link is in the description if you want to start a small colony alongside your duckweed. But we haven't even gotten to the part of the story that surprises people the most, because there is an organism, not a plant, not a fish, that can take your kitchen scraps, your manure, your food waste, and turn them into something with more protein than most animal feeds on the market today. And it does it in 8 to 12 days. If you've never seen chickens eat black soldier fly larvae before, the first time is something. There is no hesitation, no inspection, no picking through. They eat like something ancient just woke up in them. Black soldier fly larvae, or BSFL, as researchers refer to them, are not new. The fly itself, Hermetia illicens, exists naturally across much of North America. You've probably seen the adult fly without knowing what it was. A dark, wasp-like insect that doesn't bite, doesn't sting, and has no interest in your food. But its larvae are something else entirely. BSFL can consume organic waste at a rate that composting worms can't match. Food scraps, vegetable peelings, manure, coffee grounds, spent grain from brewing. The larvae process it. They grow, and in doing so, they concentrate the nutrients from that waste into their own bodies. And the result? Larvae that are, by dry weight, approximately 40 to 50% protein and 25 to 35% fat. According to research published by institutions including Wageningen University in the Netherlands, one of the world's leading agricultural research centers. For a small flock chicken keeper, this creates a possibility that is genuinely worth stopping to consider. Your kitchen scraps, the things you're throwing away, can become a live protein source for your flock. What was a disposal problem becomes a production input. Setting up a small-scale BSFL colony doesn't require significant space or infrastructure. A bin, shade, organic material as feedstock, and the flies themselves, which in most of North America will colonize an appropriate bin naturally during warm months. You don't need to purchase them. You don't need to maintain a complicated system. You create the conditions, the flies do the rest. This is just something that takes about 5 minutes of setup to understand and was never taught in most American farming conversations. If you're not ready to set up a live colony yet, dried black soldier fly larvae are widely available and a practical way to introduce this protein to your flock while you figure out the rest. I've linked a trusted source in the description. Now here's the part that links everything together, because we've been talking about individual components, a plant here, an insect there. But the farmers who are getting the most out of these systems aren't treating them as individual tricks. They're combining them into something that functions as a single, coherent organism. And the results of that combination are almost impossible to believe until you've seen it for yourself. Imagine a property no larger than a generous suburban backyard. On one end, a shallow pond, roughly the size of a large above-ground swimming pool. Growing duckweed and azolla, fed by a slow overflow of water enriched by chicken manure from the adjacent yard. On the other end, a compost system, receiving kitchen scraps, garden waste, spent feed. Colonized by black soldier fly larvae from spring through early fall. In the middle, a small chicken yard, where the flock has access to fresh greens from the pond harvest, fresh larvae from the compost, sprouted grain in a small trough, just enough to round out their nutrition. Your farm purchases commercial feed, but not 100 pounds every 2 weeks, maybe 25, maybe less depending on the season, because the system is producing the rest. This is a framework that researchers in sustainable agriculture have been documenting for years across multiple continents. Acre, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, maintains resources on alternative protein production, including BSFL, aquatic crops, and on-farm feed systems for small landholders. The information exists. It's just scattered, disconnected, never assembled into a picture someone can actually look at and say, "Oh, I see how this works." And the farmers who have built versions of this system, even rough, imperfect, partial versions, describe the same shift in how they think about their land. They stop thinking of feed as a line item. They start thinking of their property as a system that produces feed. That's a different relationship entirely. And some of the most powerful pieces of that relationship don't require a pond at all. Some of them grow from a single root cutting, something European farmers have known for 400 years, and most American small farmers have completely forgotten. European farmers protected Comfrey the way we protect infrastructure. For 400 years, possibly much longer, farmers across Britain, Germany, and Eastern Europe grew it along the edges of their fields. They called it knitbone. Some called it Comfrey, and they fed it to everything. Comfrey is perennial. You plant it once. It comes back every year. You cut it down 4, 5, sometimes 6 times in a growing season, and it regrows, aggressively, stubbornly, as though it resents being stopped. One established patch can supply supplemental green feed for a decade or more without replanting. But what makes Comfrey something more than just a hardy green is what it does underground. Most fodder plants draw nutrients from the first foot or two of topsoil. Comfrey's roots go down 3-4 feet into subsoil layers that most plants never reach. And as it grows, it pulls minerals from those deep layers: calcium, potassium, phosphorus, nitrogen, and concentrates them in its leaves. It functions as a mineral pump. Young Comfrey growth, harvested before the plant fully flowers, runs approximately 20 to 30% crude protein by dry weight. Chickens eat it, pigs eat it, rabbits thrive on it. European smallholders have fed it to dairy cattle as a supplemental green through summer months for centuries. Comfrey grows across most of the United States. It tolerates poor soil. It tolerates neglect. Once established, it is nearly impossible to kill. The cost to start? A root cutting, sometimes less than $1, sometimes free from a neighbor with more than they need. The variety worth looking for specifically is Bocking 14, a sterile hybrid that won't spread beyond where you plant it, which matters if you're working with a smaller property. I've linked a source for root cuttings in the description. The farmers who carried Comfrey cuttings across borders 400 years ago weren't following a trend. They were protecting something they couldn't afford to lose. And on a small farm today, neither can you. But the next system requires none of that. No soil, no pond, no deep roots, nothing but a handful of grain and a few days of patience. Here's something that doesn't require a new system at all. Just a new understanding of the grain you're already buying. A bucket of grain becomes trays of living feed in less than a week. Not metaphorically, not approximately. In 4 to 6 days, the same grain sitting in your feed room transforms into a living, growing feed that is nutritionally distinct from what you started with. The practice is ancient. Farmers across Central Asia, Northern Europe, and parts of East Africa have fed sprouted grain to livestock for centuries, not because they understood the biology, but because they could see the results. Animals preferred it, consumed it with more enthusiasm, and appeared to do better on less of it. For a small flock owner today, the setup is minimal. Trays, grain, water, a surface that drains. Stackable sprouting trays made specifically for fodder production make this easier to manage at scale, especially if you're running multiple batches at different stages. There's a link in the description. Soak the grain for 8 to 12 hours. Drain and rinse, leave an indirect light. Rinse once a day. Wheat, barley, oats, sunflower seeds, lentils. Most common grains and legumes will sprout successfully. If you want to start with something reliable, whole barley and organic wheat berries are the most forgiving for first-time fodder growers, and I've linked both in the description so you know exactly what to look for. Farmers who incorporate sprouted grain consistently report stretching their purchase feed significantly, sometimes by 20% or more, not by reducing what they offer the flock, but by giving the flock feed that works harder. It is the oldest upgrade available to any grain, and it costs nothing but time. The farmers who are quietly building these integrated systems aren't rejecting modern agriculture. They're not ideologues. They're pragmatists. They looked at their feed bill. They looked at their land. And they asked a question that more people are starting to ask. What if I grew more of this myself? Not all of it. Most of them are still buying feed, but less of it every season. And with every season, their dependency shrinks. Their land becomes more alive. Their flock becomes healthier. Their cost curve bends in a direction it couldn't bend before. For most of the last century, Americans were taught that farming meant buying inputs forever. Feed, fertilizer, supplements, deliveries. The inputs arrive, the bills arrive with them, and the farm exists somewhere in between, dependent on systems it didn't build and can't control. But across the world, millions of small farmers never accepted that model. They built systems instead. Systems that fed themselves, systems that turned waste into production, systems resilient enough to survive price spikes, shortages, and instability, because they weren't built on purchasing, they were built on producing. And maybe the strangest part of all is that none of this knowledge was ever hidden. It was simply never passed on. The future of small farming, if it has a future that's affordable, that's resilient, that's worth doing, probably belongs to farms that learn to produce feed, not just purchase it, not farms with the most land, not farms with the most money, farms with the most knowledge, and the patience to let a system mature. You've just seen the surface of this, and if any part of it connected with something you've been thinking about, whether it's the duckweed, the comfrey, or the idea of a farm that feeds itself, I'd like to know which one. Drop it in the comments. Tell me where you are, what you're working with, what questions this raised, because this conversation is worth having, and it's one most of us were never invited into until now.